similar to a story that happened in 2016 inside the Bernie Sanders campaign, where there was a intelligence person implanted in Bernie's campaign, was getting a lot of press. And then it turns out, after a little investigation, he's really British intelligence. So here is another story from, you hear all about the protests in Hong Kong, and the Western media is all for the protests in Hong Kong, and we got to go save those people in Hong Kong. And so Western media's favorite Hong Kong freedom struggle writer is American ex-Amnesty staffer in yellowface. What? I didn't even know that was a thing. Here we are. A prominent Hong Kong pundit and anti-China activist named Kong Sung-gan has become a go-to source for Western media. An investigation by the Gray Zone confirms Kong as a fake identity employed by an American teacher who's a ubiquitous figure at local protests. And so this is the guy, that's who he's pretending to be. That's him in yellowface.
A faceless commentator named Kong Sung-gan has become one of the most prolific Hong Kong Twitter activists and has been cited as an expert source on the Hong Kong freedom struggle by Western mainstream media outlets including CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and The Guardian. There's just one problem. He's not who he says he is. The Gray Zone analyzed a series of clips that reveal the true identity of Kong. In the first audio clip, Kong Sung-gan can be heard talking to the Little Red podcast.
I spoke to the activist and writer Kong Sung-gan.
3.8 million protesters have been out on the streets since June 9. And, before that, there were a couple of anti-extradition protests in April and May as well.
In this second clip, an American man living in Hong Kong named Brian Kern can be heard speaking to RTHK at a march ahead of the Tiananmen Square anniversary.
It's very important to mark the occasion of the 30th anniversary of June 4 and the Tiananmen massacre. It's something that everyone in the world should remember, and especially we who live here in Hong Kong, because the effects of the Tiananmen massacre are felt by us every day in the city still.
That voice certainly seems to belong to Brian Kern, which would mean that Brian Kern is Kong Sung-gan in yellowface. A former staffer at Amnesty International, a member of their education team, with close ties to the human rights industry, Brian Kern has become a familiar figure at Hong Kong protests. He's been photographed cleaning egg stains off walls, and has even been filmed coordinating with rioters in videos circulating on social media. And what about the Western media that routinely quotes Kong as an on-the-ground expert? We hear a lot about fake news these days, but what about fake sources?
Bam! What about fake sources? What about them? So how the hell did you do that? That was kind of amazing. Well, here's the guy, and that's the guy he's pretending to be, but this is the real guy. And so just so people know, people who are familiar with the show maybe will remember when I went to Oslo, Norway to cover the Freedom Forum. And what it turned out was immediately at their opening press conference, it became super clear to me that this was just a front for regime change wars, and they were using human rights as a shield to push for war in countries that they wanted to, and they would bring people who were oppressed by the government they wanted to overthrow, and they would say, look, we have to overthrow this government because they're oppressing these people. Iran, they want to overthrow Iran, Yemen, all this. And so that's who, so I've got a firsthand taste of the bullshit of human rights, and that was Gary Kasparov and that Thor Halvorsen. And so they're big bullshitters, right? Thor Halvorsen from Venezuela, part of the people trying to overthrow that. And so people, this is the game that they play. They pretend to be fighting for human rights, but they're really intelligence operatives. Now, so Max, let me throw it to you. First, that was amazing. How did you first catch on to that? That's who this guy was.
Well, people in Hong Kong had been whispering about this. And so it just required a journalist to put the pieces together. And this character hadn't really displayed the best operational security. He was dedicating, a book to his mother. If you Google like Myron Kern, then his mother's obituary comes up and it shows that her son, Brian Kern, and his wife, Yatman, are, overseas. And it says that. And then he dedicates the book to Y, and his wife's name begins with Y, and then it's published under Pema Press, and his daughter's name is publicly listed, so you can draw all these connections. But the voice, it's like his voice is just so distinctive. There are thousands of protesters out here, and he talks in such a sort of pretentious way that you could really tell in the different interviews that he was granting in yellowface or under his own name that it was the same person. But this was sort of open secret in Hong Kong. And the reason it had come to light, besides the fact that someone hadn't forensically proven it, was that so many people there are afraid to speak out because they're afraid they'll be doxxed and harassed by the so-called freedom fighters who were, carrying out a fairly what they would call a freedom struggle, but what looked to me like a separatist rebellion that was waged in pretty violent fashion, where Chinese mainlanders, Chinese-owned shops were burned down and attacked. And, there was a lot of fear. And so I, being in the U.S., was able to do this. And I think it goes well beyond Hong Kong. I mean, we can talk about Hong Kong in a second, but this is just an indictment of how Western corporate media has reported on Hong Kong. The New York Times, Reuters, AFP, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Al Jazeera, you name it. They've all quoted Kong Song-gan as this native grassroots source who's an expert on what's happening in the freedom struggle, when it turns out he's a white guy from America who is perpetrating a hoax. And now, can you imagine what would have happened and what the reaction would be if a Russian man had posed as a Black Lives Matter leader in Portland or Baltimore? I mean, can you imagine the freak out in mainstream media if that happened and someone revealed them? They would say that this is the worst Russian disinformation operation ever to divide us along racial lines. But this precise thing happened with a former Amnesty International staffer in Hong Kong, and no mainstream media outlet will acknowledge this or speak to us about it. And then you have a Hong Kong Free Press, which was publishing Kong Song-gan's columns. This is this widely heralded, supposedly independent outlet in Hong Kong, which gets a lot of cred in mainstream U.S. media. They were in on it, it appears. And, I published photos showing Brian Kern, the American yellow-facing, hanging out with the editor-in-chief of Hong Kong Free Press. So they're basically in on a gigantic, racist, unethical hoax, and there's no consequence for them either. I don't see other journalists saying, how could you do this? How could you deceive us?
No, they're all, again, from my experience with Bellingcat, which is government-funded pro-war propaganda, the New York Times takes them as a source. Instead of debunking them, they use them as a source. The New York Times, which is why the New York Times is garbage when it comes to this kind of reporting. And so this exactly the same thing's happening there. The mainstream press is hoaxing its readers, its viewers, the people who turn to it for news, just like Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes are hoaxing you about Russiagate and about the real problems of America. It's a hoax. Go ahead.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, and now we're being hoaxed about China in so many ways, all because Trump decided to turn up the heat. But where a lot of the hoaxing is coming from the liberal left sector, which is doing Trump's bidding. There's very little separation between the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo, and a lot of putatively left outlets on the issue of China, because they fall for a lot of the human rights rhetoric that you were just explaining, that you were subjected to at the Human Rights Foundation, Oslo Freedom Forum. And basically, because the gray zone, my outlet, isn't falling for this, we're poking holes in a lot of these humanitarian deceptions and propaganda constructs. And because we're doing so in a credible way, many people are reading our work, we're starting to get attacked at a very high level. Today, Axios, which is this corporate outlet that, basically reports in little like bullet points because they think that their readers are mentally infirm or really stupid. They published this attack on us, and the reporter, who's this like complete neocon hack, actually went to the ranking Republican chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee to denounce us. There were other attacks in it. One citation was an outlet called Coda Story, which is part of the same network as Bellingcat, also funded by the U.S. government through its regime change arm, the National Endowment for Democracy. And then Hamilton 68, which you're familiar with, the German Marshall Fund. They do all the like Russian bot hysteria. They're funded by the U.S. government. So every source in this attack on us, which was trying to paint us as some kind of Chinese secret information weapon, was a U.S. government source or a U.S. government cutout, either an official source or a cutout of the intelligence apparatus. And we're supposed to be the ones who aren't the credible journalists. They called us a blog and they call us fringe and conspiracists. Please, it's because we're doing credible, actual journalism, poking holes in official deceptions, that these Cold War kooks and spooks are coming after us, and they're trying to make the rest of us into dupes.
That's exactly right. That's the only game they have, is they try to discredit you. They call you a conspiracy theorist because you caught on to their game, their pro-war game, their government-funded pro-war game, their Western imperialism. You caught on to it, and that's all they can do is try to I've had it happen to me. I had MSNBC host spread complete fabrications about me to try to discredit me because I was onto their bullshit. And that's exactly what they do to you. So I just wanted
because you're having an impact.
Yeah, and because go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, you're having a huge impact, Jimmy. I mean, it's enormous. The reaction I get when I come on your show from people I never even knew were even that interested in politics shows what an impact you're having. And the worst thing that could happen would be if the New York Times Magazine or the Atlantic or someone like that gave you a positive profile. It would show you're doing something wrong. So just keep doing what you're doing.
That's exactly right. Usually when people attack me, they get a contract with MSNBC the next week.
Yeah, exactly.
That's usually how it goes. That's so that's all. It's always good for me. Whenever somebody with an MSNBC contract is coming after me, that, oh my God, I should send you a birthday present.
That comedian Francesca or whatever. It's like,
I don't know. Yeah, she also have I don't know. Yeah, that was so. Yeah, whenever someone comes at me, it's usually because they're in line to get a job at MSNBC, and that's happened several times already. So I don't like to mention their names on my show. So I'm not going to boost them. I don't care how many times I go on MSNBC, they never make a mark, and nobody ever remembers their fucking name. So
I think there's another criteria for being on MSNBC if you come from the world of comedy, which is that you just have to be extremely annoying and unfunny. I mean, no, I don't have to name any names, but just, I mean.
So I just want to remind, but the great thing is, though, if you get the host job at MSNBC, they're going to make you Russiagate immediately, the first thing out of your mouth. It's awesome.
Like, Mehdi Hassan's the new guy on there. He's like, just what? I mean, I'm not going to say anything, but
go. You could say something about Mehdi Hassan. Go ahead. That guy. He blocked me already.
Yeah, I actually, I was in a masochistic mood on a drive recently, and I decided to listen to him on Pod Save America.
You did have time.
Mehdi Hassan, one of the best hires over at The Intercept. They're doing great work over there. Go ahead.
Yeah, great job. He always attacks their writers, too.
He's such an asshole.
To appeal to MSNBC. I mean, he works at Al Jazeera. He works at MSNBC, sort of. He works at The Intercept. I mean, how many paychecks does this guy have? And, it's the ultimate media opportunism. And he was on Pod Save America. And for 45 minutes, I listened to him spout in like turbo speed. He speaks really fast. And
yes.
The most conventional wisdom about U.S. politics possible, appealing to these, former Obama communications hacks who he thought were his key to getting like the permanent show on MSNBC. And it's just like, first of all, why do I need some British guy to spout conventional U.S. horse race politics to me? What do you even stand for? And then in the end, he just goes on this tirade against China, comparing it to Nazi Germany. He says Xi is the worst dictator in the world, apparently worse than, Mohammed bin Salman, who's actually caused a borderline genocide in Yemen. And those are the two perfect ingredients you need to get kicked upstairs in corporate media. Signing up for the new Cold War. He attacked Trump on China, but his attacks on Trump were because Trump was not competent enough in turning up the heat on China. And he claimed that Trump secretly admires Xi. After the Trump administration basically violates longstanding U.S. policy on the South China Sea, is running naval drills in the South China Sea, compels Australia to join, locks up the CFO of Huawei, compelling Canada to do that, implements a trade war costing like $150 billion in tariffs on China, and then pushes one sanctions bill after another, basically launches a Cold War. He represents the most cynical corporate shill who still can't quite get, after years and years of opportunism, to the place he wants to be, which is in the chair where Chris Hayes, another figure who comes out of putatively progressive media, now sits, basically saying and doing nothing that makes any concrete progressive difference.
100%. I just want to remind people who turn to places like MSNBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post for their information about foreign policy or Russia or China or anything, that they are now who's being naive, Kay? You really think you're going to get the truth about any of that shit from any of those places, especially MSNBC? Here is, you pointed out, and I'm going to play it right now. Here is a CIA operative, former CIA operations director, John Stockwell, explained how Langley works the U.S. media. This is how the intelligence community works the U.S. media. Here we go.
Another thing is to disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds. And this is a major function of the CIA. And unfortunately, of course, it overlaps into the gathering of information. You have contact with a journalist, you will give him true stories, you'll get information from him, you'll also give him false stories.
Did you buy his confidence with true stories?
You buy his confidence and set him up. We've seen this happen recently with Jack Anderson, for example, who has his intelligence sources, and he has also admitted that he's been set up by them. Every fifth story just simply being false. You also work on their human vulnerabilities to recruit them in a classic sense, to make them your agent so that you can control what they do, so you don't have to set them up sort of, by putting one over on them. So you can say, here, plant this one next Tuesday.
Can you do this with responsible reporters?
Yes, the Church Committee brought it out in 1975, and then Woodward and Bernstein put an article in Rolling Stone a couple of years later. 400 journalists cooperating with the CIA, including some of the biggest names in the business, to consciously introduce the stories into the press.
Well, give me a concrete example of how you use the press this way, how a false story is planted and how you got it published.
Well, for example, in my war, the Angola War that I helped to manage, 1/3 of my staff was propaganda. Ironically, it's called covert action inside the CIA. Outside, that means the violent part. I had propagandists all over the world, principally in London, Kinshasa, and Zambia. We would take stories which we would write and put them in the Zambia Times, and then pull them out and send them to a journalist on our payroll in Europe. But his cover story, you see, would be that he had gotten them from his stringer in Lusaka, who had gotten them from the Zambia Times.
And now you know the rest of the story. And now you know why you can't believe anything you ever hear from the government, and especially the intelligence community, unless there's evidence and you can verify it. Just like as Bill Binney said on this show, as soon as the NSA said they had high confidence that Russia had hacked into the DNC computer, he knew that they had no evidence. Otherwise, they would say we have evidence. They don't. They never did. And it's been revealed that was all bullshit made up by CrowdStrike, who also revealed they have no evidence. So this whole thing is based on nothing but no evidence. And still to this day, there are prominent progressive hosts still asking for Donald Trump's long-form birth certificate today. still asking for Donald Trump's long-form birth certificate, which is what Russiagate is. It's a hysterical reaction to an election of a president of another party that presses your lizard brain. A black guy with a Muslim name pressed the lizard brain of those people who on the right who hated him, and Donald Trump does the same thing to people like Keith Olbermann and everybody on the left. Almost everybody. There's only a handful of people who are able to report the news while Donald Trump is president. The rest of them are fucking worthless.
And there's a deliberate program to suppress what we're doing. I mean, we can talk about what John Stockwell was talking about, which is actually, the CIA working through media cutouts to propagate stories that are completely false against official enemies. That's what he was doing during the Cold War. That's what's being done in the new Cold War, and with China being the leading target. We learned last month, Time Magazine reported that the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which is the parent, U.S. government parent of media outlets like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Marti in Cuba, had budgeted $2 million to basically purchase secure communication systems for Hong Kong protesters and to help them with encrypted technology, to help them with logistics for protests. Can you imagine the reaction if CGTN or Xinhua or Chinese state media was doing the same with protesters in Portland? What kind of reaction the U.S. would have had? It would have sent a naval fleet on China. But the U.S. just happily does that all over the world. And then, it uses media to turn up the heat with all of these humanitarian interventionist propaganda constructs. But then you have what happened on Twitter this week, where Twitter implemented a policy of labeling what it called state-affiliated media. And so you saw RT and CGTN, the media outlets of the official evildoers of China and Russia, get labeled. You even saw iPanda, which happens to be supported by the Chinese government, and it disseminates dangerous images of panda bears. It was labeled Chinese state-affiliated media. But the outlets that operate under the banner of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, which were literally founded out of the CIA. Radio Free Europe was originally called Radio Liberation from Bolshevism. These outlets were not labeled. And Twitter's criteria for not labeling them, or justification, was that they actually have editorial independence, which is obvious bullshit. Just go to the U.S. Agency for Global Media's mission statement. They say our outlets advance the broad objectives of U.S. foreign policy. So they say it right there. It's a complete sham and double standard. And it shows that, in fact, Twitter is U.S. state-affiliated media, and it's working to suppress counter-hegemonic narratives. Then you have what happened to us at the Gray Zone on Wikipedia, where a consortium of neocon editors who, for all I know, could be affiliated with government or some kind of think tank, have listed us as a deprecated source. So you at Wikipedia are not allowed to cite the Gray Zone, even though no one has pointed to a single major factual error we've made. And the criteria for deprecation on Wikipedia is supposedly that you print fabricated information, but we haven't done that. They've completely violated Wikipedia rules to censor us, to suppress us. So if you go to my page, Max Blumenthal at Wikipedia, where I am basically painted as a Russian and Chinese funded Holocaust denier, I have no ability to cite anything from the Gray Zone to push back at that because we're deprecated, we're banned. And Jimmy Wales, who's blocked me on Twitter mysteriously, is overtly a right-wing libertarian ideologue, and the head of his Wikimedia Foundation, Catherine Marr, who is just vaulted to the top despite very few distinctions of this massive foundation, a nonprofit that has over $100 million in assets. If you look at her career path, it's been through the corporate world and U.S. regime change organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy. Same with the board of the Wikimedia Foundation. So you just look at these social media platforms, look at what is supposed to be an encyclopedia for the people, and you're actually looking at U.S. state-affiliated media by proxy. the national security state and the intelligence apparatus are basically preventing us from hearing alternative sources of information or doing everything they can. And that's because, those of us in alternative media are making an impact. So, my point is, it's not just what is being projected through intelligence sources or cutouts. It's what's being hidden.
Yes. So they try to do the same thing to us here because we told the truth about Syria, Libya, Venezuela, and Russiagate, and they just won't have that. And so
I've seen them. They try to cancel you. I mean, it's elite cancel culture, where if you diverge from the official line on foreign policy, you will get mob attacked on Twitter, and there will be these coordinated attacks like I've seen on you because you're a powerful voice with a big platform. You reach people across partisan lines, and you're telling them what they're not allowed to hear. Starting with Syria, the reaction we're getting on, punching holes in all the China propaganda. It reminds me so much of when we first started telling people that the Syrian white helmets are actually founded by a British military intelligence officer named James Le Mercier. They were funded by the US and British governments. And 2 weeks ago, Dutch media, mainstream media, reported that Le Mercier, who died mysteriously in Istanbul last year, had committed suicide because he had perpetrated a gigantic fraud and stolen millions from the donor countries that were supposed to go to these supposedly brave rescuers. And anyone
no coverage
who attacked you on Syria, who reported on Syria, they won't touch it for the same reason they can't touch my story on Kong Sung-gan actually being a white American guy, because it implicates them. It's an indictment of them, and it reveals them as a bunch of frauds.
Right, which is why they'll never report Russiagate correctly. They'll never report CrowdStrike admitting they had no evidence. They'll never have Bill Binney on. Still, to this day, MSNBC has never brought out a person to have a counter narrative to their 4-year evidence-free conspiracy theory that everyone who goes on MSNBC has to agree to.
Exactly. And if anything, they're just going to keep trying to find ways to keep the Russiagate narrative or Russia hysteria going. Today I read, I'm always surprised that the New York Times can outdo itself in sheer ridiculous and self-parody. I read an article about how Russia's latest election disinformation ploy was doing great damage to our election system. And so I actually read the piece because it made no sense to me on the surface. Some people burned a Bible in Portland during a protest, and Ruptly, which is basically like a wire service. It's like the Russian government wire service, and they just send a camera anywhere anything's happening. They got the money shot of Julian Assange being pulled out of the embassy. So, they're just everywhere. They just happened to film these people burning a Bible because they're filming everything. They weren't the only ones who filmed it. And because they filmed it, they're being accused of interfering in the election because that image supposedly helped Donald Trump portray Antifa as a bunch of Bible burners. But the Bible, it wasn't Russia running out and burning a Bible. Some people wanted to do it, and this outlet happened to be there. This somehow merited a major article, like a 1,500-word article in the New York Times. It's just ridiculous. Of all the things to cover right now, that's what they covered.
It's that sounds like the New York Times. That really does.
It's just getting so obscure. Does anyone realize? Don't they get sick of it?
The fact, that's how fragile their lies are. That little pieces of truth that come from a fucking jagoff comedian in his garage, they are aware of, and they are actively trying to suppress me, as they are doing to you. And again, there's only a handful of people in the country, in the whole fucking country, which is why journalism as a profession is a garbage profession in the United States. Most people doing it are garbage.
And it attracts garbage because, as Matt Taibbi said, it attracts the talentless middle class.
Yes, exactly. Look at it. It's riddled with it, right? And I have my talent's in comedy. I decided to come over to journalism because everybody here sucks. And it's easier to do a better job. I'm doing it fucking high half the time better than they do it. I can do it drunk and high better than they do. And I do. It's easy. Nothing to it. And as Aaron Matei pointed out, I'll fucking let you know I do too. I don't give a shit. No one else is going to tell you. I'll fucking tell you. Go ahead, Max.
Yeah, I think that's another reason they hate you is because you say that. We actually don't need them, and we'd be better off without them. We can make our own media. We don't need this professionalized class. I mean, one of the journalists who'd been attacking us at this U.S.-funded outlet, she went to Columbia Journalism School, of course. And you just Google right now if you're watching. Columbia Journalism School tuition. Just see what it costs for a year.
See how many CIA people teach at Columbia School of Journalism. How many people come directly from the fucking CIA that teach at the Columbia School of Journalism?
I mean, and they don't even, I mean, that's just the way people think there. You pay $115,000 a year to learn to be a complete conformist, to learn to adhere to the official line.
Yes.
That's what you learn there. That's why anyone who goes there is going to be the worst journalist possible. And you go there to make elite connections who are going to, pad your resume with bylines. That's what all the journalists I really can't stand. They're like these freelancer Brooklyn-based people, and they always say in their Twitter bio words, and it's a bunch of mainstream publications. Like they're so proud of writing some little clip job for some like faded mainstream publication or Vice or whatever. But where I think things are going, when you talk about the labeling of state-funded media, and everyone is focused on cancel culture, and not everyone, but it's like become this word that's worked its way into the zeitgeist. So baby boomers are all like, yeah, you got that cancel culture over there. Like they've never heard them use this term before. The real threat is censorship, not cancel culture.
That's right.
It's official censorship. And, so many liberals got out and they fought when William Bennett and C. Dolores Tucker proposed labeling rap records in the 90s. But now all media faces the threat of the intelligence apparatus influencing Silicon Valley to label them. And I think that's the next step, is not just going after the state-funded media, but media that diverges from the hegemonic narrative, that challenges it. And they'll call it disinformation.
Yeah,
disinformation is the new term for anything the CIA
So Max, okay, just real quick, we've had CNN lie about us, say that our Syria coverage was conspiracy theory, which it turned out to be 100% correct. And they were the ones who sent a reporter over to sniff a backpack to say there was a chemical attack. That's CNN, right? Then Facebook started doing fact-checking on our reporting about the Democrats cheating in the Iowa primary. They were completely fucking wrong. I did a video on it, exposed them. We just had Snopes do some Democratic Nancy Pelosi apologetics, trying to say that somehow Nancy Pelosi isn't funding the Department of Homeland Security. Where did the fuck they get the money from? That's Snopes. So Snopes should stick to debunking Bigfoot sightings and leave politics to people like us, because they're manufacturing consent. And and that wasn't an accident that Snopes came after us. They're giving it an order. Snopes has been given an order to come after us. Bellingcat has been given an order. CNN has been given an order. Half the jagoffs on MSNBC, YouTube have been given an order, and they fucking do it. This isn't. That's not a. It's not fantastical to think that this is exactly what the fuck's going on, because only a few people are saying the shit I'm saying.
Yeah, the fact-checking sites are some of the most insidious mechanisms, not for fact-checking, but for narrative enforcement.
Yes.
And, I did a piece with Alex Rubinstein on the empire of tech billionaire Pierre Omidyar, and he's funding so many of these fact-checking sites and Pointer, the like good journalism sites, to enforce a mainstream narrative. Then I took a look at another organization that he funds with his eBay fortune. It's called Luminate. It's a nonprofit. And I looked at their strategy plan for 2018 to 2022, and they explicitly say that they are supporting regime change efforts in countries where, quote, transition is taking place, and that they want to defend the centrist order against its greatest threats, which they name as Russia and China. So it's obvious what he's about, and yet he's funding this vast media empire that's not just The Intercept, but I mean, The Intercept is kind of morphing into The Interventionist. And I just wanted to make one more point about Wikipedia, because you've talked about this and you've had Aaron Mate on to talk about this, about Syria, about how the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has had several insiders who were on the fact-finding mission or involved in the investigation of the supposed attacks in Douma, Syria in April 2018, and how they basically have said, gone public and told Aaron, told the Gray Zone, but also gone to the UN and said this was a staged event designed to stimulate the US to wage a military attack on the Syrian government, which we all knew from the beginning was the case.
Yep.
So Aaron actually wrote an article in The Nation magazine, which is a real standard bearer of the liberal left. You can't call it a conspiracy magazine in the Gray Zone. And this went into, someone put that citation into the Wikipedia article on Duma, and it was immediately removed on the grounds that Aaron also contributes to the Gray Zone. And so they wiped that clean from the Duma entry on Wikipedia. And it was removed by someone named Philip Cross, who has edited close to 40% of my own Wikipedia entry, who spends his life, if he is a real person, editing the pages of anti-war voices like yourself to discredit and delegitimize them and make them seem like fanatics. So that's what we're faced with. But at the same time, I really think more and more people see through it. And I feel it at the Gray Zone. I feel a momentum. Our stuff is trafficking better than ever. And, you know, I get approached by people, especially young people, and they say, they thank us for what we're doing because there's so few other sources that are challenging the official line. That's what we're living with. It's really what I would call free speech with American characteristics. And I got to run now.
Okay, Max Blumenthal, great job. Everybody check out his work at the Gray Zone, his podcast, The Moderate Rebels, and his book, The Management of Savagery. Max, great work. Thank you for coming on. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Hey, everybody, this is the part where I tell you where all our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then this is why I tell you to join our premium program and get extra content, but nobody's got a fucking job. So just enjoy the video.